The old man sat on the porch of his mountain cabin, his weathered hands resting on the arms of a chair he had carved 40 years ago. The wood was smooth now, polished by decades of use, and Caleb Stone could feel every groove and imperfection beneath his palms. At 77, his body remembered things his mind sometimes forgot. The ache in his left shoulder where the bullet had gone through. The stiffness in his right knee from that fallen eagle's pass. The way his fingers curled slightly inward, shaped by years of gripping reins and rifle stocks. Below him, the valley spread out in shades of gold and amber. Autumn had come to Colorado, and with it, the kind of light that made everything look like it was burning from within. Caleb had lived through 77 such autumns, but this one felt different. Maybe because of the visitors climbing the trail toward his cabin. Maybe because he knew it was time to tell a story he had kept locked away for 29 years. Tommy Brennan reached the porch first, breathing hard from the climb. At 45, he was still strong, still carried himself like the man Caleb had taught him to be. Behind him came a boy of 12, lean and quick-eyed, stumbling a bit on the uneven ground, but determined not to show it. Tommy removed his hat. "Mr. Stone, thank you for seeing us." Caleb nodded, his eyes on the boy. "Samuel, is it?" The child straightened. "Yes, sir." "Your father says you wanted to know who I am." Samuel glanced at Tommy, then back at Caleb. "Yes, sir. Dad says you're a hero, but he won't tell me why." The word hung in the air like smoke. Hero. Caleb turned it over in his mind, testing its weight. It felt too big, too clean. Heroes were men in books, men who never hesitated, never failed, never woke up in the middle of the night with their hearts pounding and their hands shaking. "I'm not a hero, boy." Caleb's voice was rough, like stones grinding together. "But I did make a promise once, and I kept it. That's what your father means." He rose from his chair, joints protesting, and walked to a wooden box on the windowsill. The box was simple, pine-darkened by age and handling. He opened it slowly. Inside, wrapped in cloth, lay two objects. The first was a badge, tarnished and bent. United States Marshal, it read, though the letters were barely visible now. The second was a wooden cross, small enough to fit in the palm of his hand, carved with surprising delicacy. Samuel moved closer, drawn by curiosity. "Were you really a marshal?" "I was." Caleb held the badge up to the light. "A long time ago, before I came to this mountain, before I learned what it really meant to stand up for someone." Tommy settled onto the porch steps, and Samuel sat beside him. They both watched Caleb, waiting. The old man looked down at the valley one more time, at the spires of pine and the distant gleam of the river. Somewhere down there, hidden in the folds of the land, was Covenant Ridge, the town where it had all begun. The town where he had learned that sometimes doing the right thing meant going against everything you thought you believed. "This story," Caleb said quietly, "starts in the summer of 1886. I was 48 then, not old but not young either. I had been living on this mountain for 7 years, and in all that time, I had spoken to maybe a dozen people. I liked it that way. Solitude suited me, or so I told myself." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "But the truth is, I wasn't living up here because I loved the quiet. I was hiding from what I had done, from what I had failed to do." The afternoon stretched long and golden around them as Caleb Stone began to speak of the summer when everything changed. In July of 1886, Caleb Stone woke before dawn, as he always did. The cabin was cold despite the season. At 10,000 feet, even summer mornings carried a bite. He dressed in the dark, pulling on wool pants and a leather shirt that smelled of wood smoke and pine. His boots were worn but solid, resoled twice by his own hands. A man alone in the mountains could not afford to be careless about his footwear. Outside, the world was silver and black. Stars still burned overhead, brighter than any town dweller could imagine. Caleb stood on his porch and breathed in the thin air, letting it fill his lungs and clear his head. This was the ritual that began every day. The silence, the cold, the reminder that up here he was accountable to no one. He walked to the small corral behind the cabin where Storm waited. The Appaloosa was 7 years old, spotted gray and white, with intelligent eyes that followed Caleb's every movement. Storm had been with him for 5 years now, bought from a Ute trader who swore the horse could read a man's mind. Caleb was not sure about that, But he knew Storm was the most reliable companion he had ever had. "Morning, old friend." Caleb ran his hand down the horse's neck, feeling the warmth beneath the spotted coat. "We're going down today. Need to deliver medicine to the convent." Storm nickered softly and Caleb smiled. The horse understood more than most people gave him credit for. Back inside the cabin, Caleb prepared his gear with the methodical care of the man who had learned that carelessness in the mountains meant death. His Winchester Model 1873 hung above the door, cleaned and oiled 3 nights ago. He took it down, checking the action one more time. 15 rounds in the magazine. Smooth as silk. The rifle was 13 years old now, but its mechanism was still flawless. Caleb had killed his first elk with this gun, had stopped a charging bear with it, had held it across his lap on 100 lonely nights, knowing it was the only thing standing between him and whatever moved in the darkness beyond his fire. His sidearm was a Colt Peacemaker, .45 caliber, with walnut grips worn smooth by his hand. He checked the cylinder. 6 rounds as always. A man who carried an empty chamber under the hammer was a man asking for trouble. Satisfied, he packed his saddlebags. 2 canteens of water, strips of dried venison, a small leather pouch containing 20 glass vials of quinine, carefully wrapped in cloth. The medicine had cost him 3 weeks of trapping and trading across the Mexican border, but it was worth it. Malaria had been creeping north from the lowlands, and the sisters at Sacred Heart Convent had sent word they were running low on treatment. Caleb charged them less than half what a Denver apothecary would ask. Money meant little to him up here. Knowing he could help someone meant more. By the time he was ready, the sun had begun to edge over the eastern peaks, painting the sky in shades of copper and rose. Caleb swung into the saddle and Storm started down the mountain without needing to be told. The horse knew the trail as well as Caleb did. The descent took 3 hours. At first, the path was narrow and rocky, winding between stands of lodgepole pine and blue spruce. Caleb let Storm pick his own pace, trusting the horse's instincts. Around them, the forest woke slowly. A Clark's nutcracker called from high in a dead tree. A mule deer doe watched them pass, her ears swiveling, before bounding away into the brush. As they dropped in elevation, the air grew warmer, thicker. Caleb could smell sage and juniper now, replacing the sharp scent of high-altitude pine. His mind, as it often did on these long rides, drifted backward. He thought of Chicago, the noise, the smoke. The way the city had pressed in on him from all sides, full of people who wanted things, needed things, demanded things. He had been a different man there. Marshal Caleb Stone, they had called him, a name spoken with respect in some quarters, with fear in others. But that man was gone now, buried somewhere between then and now. The memory came anyway, as it always did when he let his guard down. March 1879. A warehouse on the south side of Chicago near the stockyards. The air inside had been thick with the smell of rot and urine. Caleb had gone in with his partner, Daniel Crane, following a tip about a human trafficking ring. They had expected resistance. What they found instead was silence. And children. 6 of them, locked in a room no bigger than a horse stall, ages ranging from maybe 10 to 14, filthy, terrified. When Caleb opened the door, they had shrunk back against the wall, too frightened to even cry out. One of them, a girl with blonde hair and blue eyes, had looked up at him with an expression that would haunt Caleb for the rest of his life. "Are you going to take us home?" she had whispered. Her name was Lily Harper, 12 years old, kidnapped from a farm outside Galena 3 weeks prior. Caleb had knelt beside her, making himself small, trying not to frighten her more than she already was. "I promise, we are going to get you out of here." But Daniel had pulled him aside. "We need authorization, Caleb. This is connected to someone big. The orders are to wait for federal backup. These kids don't have time to wait. It's not our call." And Caleb, God help him, had listened. He had followed the chain of command, had waited for the proper paperwork, the proper authorization, the proper procedures. 4 days later, the warehouse burned. When the fire department finally got the blaze under control and searched the ruins, they found 6 small bodies, including Lily Harper. The inquest had cleared him and Daniel of any wrongdoing. They had followed protocol. They had done everything by the book. But Caleb knew the truth. He had made a choice, and 6 children had died because of it. He had resigned his commission the next day, rode west without looking back, found this mountain and built a cabin, and told himself that if he never had to look another person in the eye again, he would be fine with that. For 7 years, it had almost worked. Storm reached the bottom of the trail and turned automatically toward Covenant Ridge. The town was small, maybe 200 souls, clustered around a crossroads where the freight road met the river trail. Caleb could see the church steeple from here, white against the blue sky. Beside it, set back in a grove of cottonwoods, was Sacred Heart Convent. The convent was a modest building, stone and timber, with a small chapel attached. It housed about 15 nuns, most of them young women who had come west to minister to the poor and the sick. Caleb knew little about them beyond their order for quinine. He preferred it that way. He rode past the town proper, avoiding the main street. People knew him by sight, but few tried to engage him in conversation anymore. The hermit from the mountain, they called him. The man who wanted to be left alone. At the convent, he dismounted in the side yard, away from the main entrance. A young novice came to take Storm's reins, and Caleb nodded his thanks but said nothing. He walked to the back door and knocked twice. Mother Prioress Helen answered. She was 64, small and bent, with a face lined by decades of hard work and harder choices. When she saw Caleb, something flickered in her eyes. Relief, maybe, or fear. "Mr. Stone," her voice was soft, barely above a whisper. "Thank you for coming." Caleb handed her the leather pouch. 20 vials, same as last time. $8 each. She took the pouch with trembling hands. Up close, Caleb could see that her eyes were red-rimmed, swollen. She had been crying. "Sister, are you all right?" "I am fine." The words came too quickly. "It is nothing, just the fatigue of age." Caleb did not believe her, but he did not press. He had learned long ago that people kept secrets for their own reasons, and most of those reasons were none of his business. He turned to go, but something made him pause. A sound, faint, barely audible over the rustle of wind in the cottonwoods. It was coming from the side of the building, from a small window set high in the stone wall. A woman's voice, low, ragged, desperate. "Please, God, please let me die." Caleb stopped walking. His hand moved instinctively to the Colt at his hip, though he did not draw it. He looked at Mother Helen and she would not meet his eyes. "What was that?" "Nothing, Mr. Stone. You should go." But Caleb was already moving toward the sound. His boots made no noise on the grass. He reached the window and looked in. What he saw would change everything. The room was small and dim, lit only by a single narrow window. In the center stood a wooden table, low and heavy, scarred by years of use. And beside the table, on her knees, was a young woman. She wore the gray habit of a novice nun, but it had been pulled down to her waist, exposing her back. Caleb's breath caught. Her back was a map of suffering. Old scars, white and raised, crisscrossed the pale skin. New welts, angry and red, lay over the old ones. Her wrists were bound with thick hemp rope to the legs of the table, the fibers biting into her flesh hard enough to draw blood. Her head hung forward, dark hair matted with sweat. She was shaking, either from pain or cold or both. As Caleb watched, frozen, she lifted her head slightly and whispered again, "Please, God, if you are there, send someone. Anyone." Behind her in the shadows stood a man in black. Father Dominic Reeves. Caleb had seen him before from a distance. Tall, thin, silver-haired. The kind of man who moved through the world with the absolute certainty that he spoke for God. In his hand was a bullwhip, leather braided tight and dark with the old stains that might have been oil or might have been blood. "You must learn," Father Dominic said, his voice devoid of emotion. "That doubt is sin, and sin must be purged. This is for your soul, Sister Grace. Do you understand?" The woman, Sister Grace, did not answer. She had no strength left to answer. Caleb's vision narrowed. His heart, which had been beating slow and steady, began to pound. His hands clenched into fists. And then Sister Grace lifted her head one more time, and her eyes met his through the window. For a moment, neither of them moved. She stared at him, and he stared back. Her eyes were gray, he saw now. Gray and filled with something far worse than pain. They were filled with resignation, with the absolute certainty that no help would come. Her lips moved. The words were barely a whisper, but Caleb heard them as clearly as if she had shouted. "If you are going to do something, please do not. I am not worth it." But if you are just going to stand there and watch, then please go." The words hit him like a physical blow, because he had heard them before. 7 years ago, in a different voice, from a different girl, Lily Harper had said almost the same thing the night before she died. Caleb stepped back from the window. His legs felt weak. His hands shook. He turned and walked quickly towards Storm, his mind a chaos of images and sounds and memories he had spent 7 years trying to bury. Mother Helen was gone. The back door was closed. Caleb mounted Storm and rode out of the convent yard without looking back. He took the river trail at a gallop, putting distance between himself and that window, that room, that girl with the gray eyes. But the image followed him. The scars, the rope, the resignation in her face. He was halfway back to the mountain before he finally pulled Storm to a halt. They stood in the middle of the trail, the horse breathing hard, the man staring at nothing. Caleb reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small object wrapped in cloth. He unfolded it carefully. Inside was a yellow hair ribbon, faded by time and handling. It had belonged to Lily Harper. He had carried it for 7 years. A reminder, a penance. He looked at the ribbon, then looked back the way he had come, toward the convent, toward Sister Grace. "I walked away from Lily," he said aloud, though there was no one to hear him but the horse in the wind, "and she died." Storm shifted beneath him, waiting. Caleb closed his fist around the ribbon. Not this time. He turned Storm around and rode hard toward Covenant Ridge. The town of Covenant Ridge had one sheriff, one jail, and one saloon that served as the unofficial center of civic life. Caleb rode straight past all three, heading instead for the small building at the north end of the main street. A wooden sign hung above the door. Sheriff Daniel Crane. Caleb tied Storm to the hitching post and pushed through the door without knocking. Daniel Crane looked up from a stack of papers, his face registering surprise then concern. He was 2 years younger than Caleb, 46 now, with gray streaking his dark hairs and lines carved deep around his eyes. They had been partners once back in the days when both of them wore federal badges, when both of them believed in the law. "Caleb?" Daniel stood, setting down his pen. "How long has it been? 3 years?" "Longer." Caleb's voice was flat. "I need to report a crime." Daniel's expression shifted. He gestured toward a chair. "Sit down, tell me." Caleb remained standing. "I saw a woman being tortured at Sacred Heart Convent, a nun, young. Her back was covered in scars. She was tied to a table. Father Dominic was standing over her with a whip." The words came out clipped, factual. Caleb had learned long ago that emotion did not help in situations like this. Facts did. Daniel listened without interrupting. When Caleb finished, he sank back into his own chair and rubbed his face with both hands. "God above," he muttered. "Are you certain about what you saw? Do you think I would ride down here if I was not?" "No," Daniel looked up. "No, you would not. But Caleb, this is complicated. You are talking about Father Dominic Reeves. He is the head priest at Sacred Heart. He is connected to powerful people. His brother owns half the land in this valley. I do not care who he is connected to. You should, because if we go after him without ironclad evidence, he will bury us, and that girl will disappear." Caleb's jaw tightened. "So what do we do?" "We need proof, medical testimony, eyewitness statements, and we need her to testify." "She is too afraid to testify. I saw it in her eyes." "Then we find other witnesses, people who work at the convent, people who have seen something but have been too scared to come forward." Before Caleb could respond, the door opened behind him. A younger man stepped in, tall and handsome, with blonde hair and a badge pinned to his vest. Deputy Marcus Reed. Caleb had seen him around town but never spoken to him. Marcus looked from Daniel to Caleb, his expression carefully neutral. "Sheriff, I heard voices. Is there a problem?" Daniel hesitated, and in that hesitation, Caleb saw something shift. A calculation. A decision being made about who to trust. "No problem, Marcus. Mr. Stone was just leaving." Marcus smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Mr. Stone, the hermit from the mountain, I have heard about you." Caleb studied him. The deputy wore a gold chain around his neck, visible above his collar, an expensive piece for a man on a lawman's salary. And when Marcus shifted his weight, Caleb caught a glimpse of a ring on his right hand, a signet ring engraved with the initials D and R, Dominic Reeves. Caleb's eyes met Daniel's, and he saw that the sheriff had noticed too. "I will be going now," Caleb said quietly. He nodded to Daniel. "Thank you for your time, Sheriff." He walked out before Marcus could say anything else. Outside, he stood beside Storm for a long moment, thinking. Then he swung into the saddle and rode not toward the mountain, but toward the far end of town, where a small clapboard house sat behind a white picket fence. Dr. Abigail Carter answered his knock almost immediately. She was 40, handsome rather than pretty, with dark hair pulled back in a severe bun and sharp, intelligent eyes. She had been one of the first female physicians in Colorado, and she had fought for every inch of respect she now commanded. "Mr. Stone," she did not seem surprised to see him. "Come in." Inside, her home smelled of carbolic acid and dried herbs. Medical texts lined the shelves, and a skeleton hung in the corner, its bones yellowed with age. Caleb removed his hat and stood awkwardly in the center of the room. "I need your help, doctor." "I assumed as much. You do not strike me as a man who makes social calls." She gestured toward a chair. "Sit. Talk." Caleb told her everything. The window, Sister Grace, the scars, the rope. When he finished, Abigail Carter sat in silence for a long moment, her fingers steepled beneath her chin. "I have heard rumors," she said finally, "about the convent, about Father Dominic. Nothing concrete, but enough to make me uneasy. Will you examine her, if I can get her out of there?" "Yes." The answer came without hesitation. "But you need to understand what you are asking. If I write a medical report documenting abuse, it will destroy that man's reputation. It will tear this town apart, and people will fight back." "I know." She looked at him, really looked at him, and Caleb had the sense she was seeing past the weathered face and the mountain man exterior to something deeper. "Why are you doing this? You do not know this woman." Caleb thought of Lily Harper, of the yellow ribbon in his saddlebag, of 7 years spent trying to forget and failing every single night. "Because I did not do it before," he said quietly. "And I should have." Abigail nodded slowly. "Then I will help you." The sun was beginning to set by the time Caleb made his third and final stop. The Protestant church stood at the opposite end of town from Sacred Heart, smaller and plainer, built of rough-hewn logs rather than stone. Reverend Josiah Blackwell was in the cemetery behind the church, tending to the graves. He was 54, tall and gaunt, with a thick black beard streaked with gray. When he saw Caleb approaching, he set down his shears and waited. "Or Stone, this is unexpected." "Reverend." Caleb stopped a few feet away. "I need to ask you about Sacred Heart Convent, about Father Dominic." Something flickered in Josiah's eyes. Anger, perhaps, or pain. "What do you want to know?" "The truth." Josiah looked down at the grave he had been tending. The headstone read, "Sister Mary Therese, 1873 to 1883. Died at 20 years old. 3 years ago," and Josiah Borshi said quietly, "I stood before a town council meeting and accused Father Dominic of abusing the women in his care. I said that God does not call us to torture one another in his name. I said that what was happening at Sacred Heart was a sin against heaven." "What did they say?" "They said I was jealous, that I was trying to turn people away from the true church, that I was a heretic and a liar." Josiah's voice was steady, but his hands clenched. "Father Dominic sued me for slander. I lost everything, my reputation, my congregation. If not for a few faithful families, I would have lost this church too. But you were right. Being right does not matter if no one believes you." Josiah looked up. "Why are you asking me this now?" Caleb told him, and when he was done, Josiah Blackwell closed his eyes and took a long, shaking breath. "Sister Mary," he said, "the girl buried here. She came to me 6 months before she died. She was terrified. She said Father Dominic was punishing her for sins she did not commit. She begged me to help her." "What did you do?" "I went to the bishop. I wrote letters. I made noise, and 2 weeks later, Sister Mary was found dead. They said it was an accident, a fall down the stairs." Josiah opened his eyes. "But I saw her body before they buried her. She had bruises on her wrists, like rope burns." The two men stood in the fading light, surrounded by graves. "If you testify," Caleb said, "they will come after you again." "Let them." Josiah's voice was hard. This time I will not back down. Caleb rode back to Daniel Crane's office as darkness fell over Covenant Ridge. The sheriff was alone now, the lamp on his desk casting long shadows across the walls. I have 3 witnesses, Caleb said without preamble. Dr. Carter will examine Sister Grace and write a medical report. Reverend Blackwell will testify about Sister Mary, and I will testify about what I saw today. Daniel looked tired, older than his 46 years. It is still not enough, Caleb. We need a warrant to search the convent, and for that, we need a judge to sign off. Judge Harrison here in town will never do it. He and Father Dominic play cards every Thursday. Then we go to another judge. The nearest one willing to cross Father Dominic is Judge Elizabeth Morgan in Boulder, 50 miles from here, and it is already dark. Caleb met his old partner's eyes. Then we ride through the night. For a long moment, Daniel did not move. Then he stood, reached for his coat, and pulled his own Winchester from the rack. Reverend Blackwell has a wagon. We will need him to come with us. 3 men carry more weight than 2. They rode out of Covenant Ridge an hour later, just the 3 of them. Caleb on Storm, Daniel on his roan gelding, Josiah driving a small wagon pulled by a pair of draft horses. The night was cold and clear, the stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. No one spoke much. They saved their breath for the road, which climbed steadily into the high country, following a trail that switched back up the slopes of Arapahoe Pass. At this altitude, even in summer, the air carried a bite. Their breath seemed in the moonlight. Somewhere behind them, Marcus Reed sat in the window of the sheriff's office and watched them go. Then he stood, pulled on his coat, and walked quickly towards Sacred Heart Convent. At the convent, Father Dominic was preparing for bed when he heard the knock. He opened the door to find Marcus standing in the shadows, breathing hard. They are going to Boulder, Marcus said without preamble. Crane, that mountain man, and the Protestant minister. They are going to see Judge Morgan. Father Dominic's face did not change, but his eyes went cold and flat. When? They left an hour ago. They will be there by dawn. Father Dominic nodded slowly. Then we move Sister Grace tonight. Wake Mother Helen. Tell her to prepare the girl for transport. We are taking her to St. Helena Asylum in Denver. What about the mountain man? Let him get his warrant. By the time they return, Sister Grace will be gone. And without her, they have nothing. Marcus hesitated. Father, if we are caught moving her, we will not be caught. Father Dominic's voice was soft, but it carried the weight of absolute authority. Go, now. In the dormitory wing of the convent, Sister Grace lay on a narrow cot, too exhausted to sleep. Her back throbbed with every breath. The ropes had left deep marks on her wrists, and her shoulders ached from being held in the same position for hours. She stared at the ceiling and thought about the man she had seen through the window. The mountain man with the weathered face and the haunted eyes. For just a moment, when their gazes met, she had felt something she had not felt in 8 years. Hope. But hope was a dangerous thing. Hope led to disappointment. Hope led to more pain. She closed her eyes and prayed, not to be saved, but to be strong enough to endure whatever came next. Caleb, Daniel, and Josiah reached Boulder just as the first light of dawn touched the peaks. They had ridden through the night without stopping, their horses lathered and blowing hard. Judge Elizabeth Morgan's house stood at the edge of town, a solid 2-story structure built of stone and timber. Caleb dismounted and knocked on the door. There was no answer. He knocked again, louder this time. Finally, a light appeared in an upstairs window. A moment later, the door opened to reveal Judge Morgan herself, gray-haired and sharp-eyed, holding a shotgun. This had better be good, she said. It took an hour to explain everything. Judge Morgan listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes on a pad of paper. When they finished, she set down her pen and looked at each of them in turn. Mr. Stone, I am going to ask you one question, and I want you to think very carefully before you answer. Are you absolutely certain about what you saw? Caleb thought of Sister Grace, of her gray eyes, of the resignation in her face. I am certain. Judge Morgan nodded. She turned to a cabinet, pulled out an official form, and began to fill it in with quick, precise strokes. When she was done, she signed her name at the bottom and pressed her seal into the wax. This warrant authorizes you to search Sacred Heart Convent, Interview witnesses and remove Sister Grace Meredith into protective custody pending a full investigation. It is valid for 72 hours. She looked at them over the rim of her spectacles. If Father Dominic is innocent, he will be cleared. If he is guilty, may God have mercy on his soul. They rode back toward Covenant Ridge as fast as their tired horses could manage, but they were still 5 miles out when they met a farmer heading to market. "Sheriff," the farmer called out, "you looking for that nun?" Daniel reined in. "What nun?" "The one from Sacred Heart. Saw Father Dominic and that deputy of yours loading a girl into a wagon around midnight. Headed toward Denver, looked like." Caleb felt his blood turn to ice. He looked at Daniel, and the sheriff's face had gone pale. "They took her," Daniel said. "God above, they took her." Caleb turned Storm toward the mountains. "I know where they are going. There is only one road to Denver from here, but there is a shortcut. Eagles Pass." Daniel's eyes widened. "Caleb, no, that trail is barely wide enough for a horse. One slip and you fall 900 feet. Even in daylight, it is dangerous. I rode it once before, 13 years ago when I was still a marshal. We were tracking a fugitive who knew the territory. My partner said it was suicide, but I made it through." Caleb's jaw set. Storm can handle it, and it cuts 2 hours off the journey to the Denver road. 2 hours might not matter if you are dead at the bottom of a canyon, and 2 hours might be all Grace has. Caleb pulled his arm free. "I am going." He spurred Storm into a gallop and disappeared into the trees, leaving Daniel and Josiah staring after him. The trail to Eagles Pass was everything Daniel had warned and worse. It climbed steeply through thick forest, then emerged onto a narrow ridge of exposed rock. On one side was the mountain. On the other was a drop of 900 feet straight down. Storm picked his way carefully, ears flat against his head. Caleb leaned forward in the saddle, trying to keep his weight centered, trying not to think about what would happen if the horse stumbled. The wind up here was fierce, tearing at his clothes and bringing tears to his eyes. Below, he could see the river road, a thin brown line winding through the valley. Somewhere on that road was a wagon carrying Sister Grace toward a place from which she might never return. Caleb pushed Storm harder than he should have. The horse responded, trusting him, even though every instinct must have been screaming to slow down, to be careful. They made it across the pass in an hour and a half, shaving precious minutes off the journey. On the far side, the trail descended sharply, switchbacking down through stands of aspen and spruce. And there at the bottom, beside a creek where the road from Covenant Ridge met the Denver highway, Caleb saw it. A wagon stopped to water the horses. Father Dominic stood beside the team. Marcus Reed sat in the driver's seat, and in the back, barely visible beneath a canvas tarp, was a small figure that could only be Sister Grace. Caleb dismounted 100 yards away and tied Storm to a tree. Then he pulled his Winchester from its scabbard, checked the action one more time, and walked into the clearing. Father Dominic saw him first. The priest's face registered surprise, then calculation, then a cold, controlled fury. "Mr. Stone, you are persistent. I will give you that." Caleb stopped 20 feet away, the rifle held loosely in his hands. "Step away from the wagon." "Or what? You will shoot a priest?" "If I have to." Marcus Reed's hand moved toward his sidearm, but Caleb swung the Winchester toward him. "Do not." The deputy froze. From the back of the wagon came a sound, a whimper, then a voice, weak but unmistakable. You came back." Sister Grace pulled herself upright, her hands still bound, her face pale. Beside her sat another figure in gray. Sister Ann Fletcher, barely 20 years old, her face streaked with tears. She had been silent during the entire journey, but now she looked at Grace, then at Caleb, then at Father Dominic, and something in her young face changed. "Sister Ann," Father Dominic said sharply, sensing danger. "Sit down." But Ann was already moving. Her hands, which had been folded in her lap in the posture of obedience she had been taught since childhood, reached for the rope binding Grace's wrists. Her fingers trembled, but they did not stop. "Sister Ann, I command you to stop." Ann's voice was small, but clear. "No, Father, I will not." She worked at the knots, and Grace stared at her with wonder. "Ann, they will punish you for this. Let them." Ann's tears fell faster now, but her hands kept working. I should have done this years ago. When I first saw what he was doing to you, when Sister Mary died, when Sister Claire disappeared. I told myself it was not my place, that I was too young, too scared. But I was wrong. I have been wrong for so long. The rope came free, and Grace's hands dropped to her lap, marked with deep grooves where the hemp had cut into her flesh. Father Dominic lunged forward, but Caleb swung the Winchester toward him. Stay where you are. Anne helped Grace climb down from the wagon, supporting her weight when Grace's legs threatened to give out. The young nun looked up at Caleb, her face filled with a mixture of fear and desperate courage. Please, sir, please do not let him take us back. Sister Grace pulled herself fully upright, her hands now free, her gray eyes meeting Caleb's with that same wonder. You came back, Grace said. And Anne, you stood up. Anne nodded, still crying. I am so sorry it took me this long. Caleb kept his gaze on Father Dominic. I am taking them both out of here. They are under the care of the church. You have no authority. I have a warrant from Judge Elizabeth Morgan. Signed and sealed. Father Dominic's expression did not change, but something flickered in his eyes. Fear, maybe, or the beginning of it. Behind them, the sound of hoofbeats. Daniel and Josiah rode into the clearing, followed by Dr. Abigail Carter in her buggy. They had caught up at last. Daniel dismounted, one hand on his own weapon. Father Dominic, Deputy Reed, you are both under arrest for kidnapping and obstruction of justice. For a moment, no one moved. The only sound was the creak and the wind in the aspens. Then Marcus Reed made his choice. His hand moved slowly toward the revolver at his hip. Caleb's finger found the trigger of his Winchester. Time seemed to slow, and in that frozen moment, Caleb knew that whatever happened next would determine whether Grace lived or died. Marcus Reed's hand closed around the grip of his revolver. Time seemed to slow. Caleb saw the deputy's fingers tighten, saw the barrel begin to rise, and his body moved before his mind fully processed the threat. He swung the Winchester up and fired. The shot was deafening in the morning quiet. Marcus jerked backward, the gun flying from his hand. He clutched his right shoulder, blood seeping between his fingers. His face twisted in shock and pain. Father Dominic lunged toward the wagon, toward Sister Grace, but Daniel was faster. The sheriff grabbed the priest by the arm and spun him around, slamming him face first against the side of the wagon. Do not move. Josiah had already jumped down from his horse and was pulling Sister Grace from the wagon bed. She collapsed into his arms, her legs too weak to hold her weight. Dr. Carter rushed over, medical bag in hand, and began checking Grace's vital signs even as Josiah carried her to the shade of a nearby cottonwood. Caleb kept his rifle trained on Marcus, who had sunk to his knees, still clutching his shoulder. The deputy's face had gone white. The bullet had gone through clean, missing bone and major vessels, but the wound was bleeding freely. You shot me, Marcus said, his voice thick with disbelief. You shot a lawman. You drew first. Caleb's voice was flat. And you stopped being a lawman the moment you chose to protect a criminal instead of the law. Daniel produced a pair of iron manacles and secured Father Dominic's wrists behind his back. The priest did not struggle, but his eyes burned with cold rage. This is persecution, Dominic said. You are attacking the church itself. The bishop will hear of this. Senator Bradford will hear of this. You are all finished. Maybe. Daniel's voice was calm. But you are under arrest. Kidnapping, false imprisonment, assault. We can add more charges later. He turned to Marcus, who was swaying slightly, his eyes unfocused. Marcus, I am placing you under arrest as well. Conspiracy, obstruction, aiding and abetting. Can you stand? Marcus did not answer. His eyes rolled back and he toppled sideways into the dirt, unconscious from blood loss and shock. Dr. Carter looked up from her examination of Sister Grace. I need to tend to the deputy before he bleeds out. Reverend, press this cloth against her back. Keep pressure on the worst of the wounds. She moved quickly to Marcus's side, cutting away his shirt to expose the bullet wound. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, cleaning, packing, bandaging. Within minutes, she had the bleeding under control and Marcus was beginning to stir. Caleb finally lowered the Winchester and walked over to where Sister Grace lay beneath the tree. Up close, in full daylight, the extent of her injuries was horrifying. Her back was a lattice of old scars and fresh wounds. Her wrists were rubbed raw from the ropes, some areas down to the muscle. She was dangerously thin, her cheekbones sharp beneath pale skin, but her eyes were open, and they were watching him. "Why?" she whispered. "You do not know me. Why did you come back?" Caleb knelt beside her. For a moment, he did not know how to answer. How could he explain 7 years of guilt? 7 years of waking up in the night, seeing Lily Harper's face. 7 years of knowing he had failed when it mattered most? "Because I should have come back before," he said finally, "for someone else, and I did not. And she died." Understanding flickered in Grace's eyes. "The girl, Lily." Caleb's throat tightened. "How do you know that name?" "You said it. When you were fighting, you said her name." Grace's hand moved slowly, painfully, until her fingers touched his. "I am sorry you lost her, but you saved me. That has to count for something." Before Caleb could respond, Dr. Carter returned, wiping her hands on a cloth. "The deputy will live. Now let me look at you properly, child." She began a thorough examination, her face growing grimmer with each discovery. 23 scars on Grace's back, ranging from months to years old. 7 fresh welts from within the past 2 weeks. 2 ribs that had been broken and healed incorrectly, causing chronic pain. Signs of prolonged malnutrition. Evidence of repeated trauma to the wrists and shoulders from being bound. When she was done, Dr. Carter sat back on her heels and looked at Daniel. "This is the worst case of systematic abuse I have seen in 20 years of practice. Whoever did this should hang." Father Dominic, still manacled to the wagon wheel, spoke for the first time since his arrest. His voice was calm, almost gentle. "I was saving her soul. She was full of doubt, full of sin. The body must suffer so the spirit can be purified. This is the teaching of the saints. This is the path to God." Grace flinched at his words, and Caleb saw something break in her expression. Not pain, not fear, but a kind of terrible understanding. "You believe that," she said softly. "You actually believe you were helping me." "Of course, I have dedicated my life to bringing souls to God." "You were lost, Grace. I was trying to show you the way." "By torturing me?" Her voice was still quiet, but there was steel in it now. "By making me hate myself, by making me wish I was dead. By teaching you that this world is suffering, and that only through suffering can we reach heaven." Grace closed her eyes. When she opened them again, tears were streaming down her face, but her voice was steady. "Then your God is not my God, because my God does not want me to suffer. My God wants me to be free." Silence fell over the clearing. Even Father Dominic had no answer to that. Daniel checked the sun's position. "We need to move. It is a long ride back to Covenant Ridge, and we have a wounded man and a severely injured woman." "Dr. Carter, can she travel?" "Not on horseback. She needs to be in the wagon, lying down, and we need to move slowly." They made camp there for the remainder of the day, letting Grace rest and Marcus stabilize. Caleb and Josiah took turns standing watch while Daniel wrote out formal arrest warrants and documented the scene. Dr. Carter tended to both patients, though she gave most of her attention to Grace. As the afternoon wore on, Grace fell into an exhausted sleep. Caleb sat nearby, rifle across his knees, watching the surrounding forest. His mind kept turning over what Father Dominic had said. I was saving her soul. The man genuinely believed he was doing good. That made him more dangerous than any outlaw Caleb had ever faced. An outlaw knew he was breaking the law. But a man who believed God was on his side, that man would never stop, never question, never doubt. It was almost dark when Daniel came to sit beside him. "You know what happens next, do not you?" Daniel's voice was quiet. "This is going to tear the town apart. Maybe the whole territory. Father Dominic has powerful friends. The church will close ranks. They will call this an attack on religious freedom. They will make us out to be the villains." "I know. And you are still willing to go through with it?" Caleb looked at Grace, sleeping fitfully beneath Josiah's coat. "She trusted me when she had no reason to trust anyone. I am not going to betray that trust." Daniel nodded slowly. "Then we do this together, like old times." "Like old times?" They clasped hands once briefly, and that was enough. The journey back to Covenant Ridge took 2 days. They traveled slowly, stopping frequently to let Grace rest and to change Marcus's bandages. The deputy remained sullen and silent, refusing to speak except to demand water. Father Dominic, by contrast, seemed almost serene. He prayed constantly, his lips moving in silent recitation of Latin prayers. On the evening of the second day, they finally saw the lights of Covenant Ridge ahead. But as they drew closer, Caleb saw something that made his jaw tighten. A crowd had gathered in the town square. 50 people, maybe more. Some carried torches, and at the front of the crowd stood a tall, imposing man in expensive clothes, Magnus Blackwood, Father Dominic's older brother. Daniel reined in, raising his hand to stop the wagon. This could get ugly. Magnus stepped forward as they approached. He was 60 years old, with silver hair and the kind of face that looked like it had been carved from granite. He had made his fortune in land and cattle, and he wielded power in this valley the way some men wielded a knife. Sheriff Crane, Magnus's voice carried easily in the quiet evening. I understand you have arrested my brother. That is correct, Mr. Blackwood. Father Dominic has been charged with multiple counts of assault, false imprisonment, and kidnapping. On whose testimony? Multiple witnesses, including physical evidence documented by Dr. Carter. Magnus's eyes flicked to the wagon where Grace lay, then to Caleb. And this mountain hermit is one of your witnesses? A man who has not spoken 10 words to anyone in 7 years? Whose word against my brother's? My word stands, Caleb said quietly. Your word. Magnus smiled, but there was no warmth in it. The word of a disgraced former marshal who ran away from Chicago after children died on his watch. Yes, Mr. Stone, I know who you are. Did you think your past would stay buried forever? The words hit like a punch to the gut. Caleb felt the eyes of the crowd on him, felt their judgment, felt the old shame rising up. But then he felt something else, a hand on his arm. He looked down and saw that Grace had pulled herself upright in the wagon. She was pale and shaking, barely able to stand, but her eyes were clear. His past does not matter, she said, her voice carrying despite its weakness. What matters is that he did not walk away when he saw me suffering. What matters is that he risked everything to help someone he did not even know. That is not the action of a coward, Mr. Blackwood. That is the action of a good man. The crowd shifted. A few people began whispering. Magnus's confident expression flickered. Daniel seized the moment. We are taking Father Dominic and Deputy Reed to the jail. Anyone who interferes will be arrested for obstruction. This is not a mob. This is a lawful proceeding. Now clear the way. For a long moment, no one moved. Then an elderly woman at the edge of the crowd stepped aside. Then another and another. The crowd parted, and Daniel drove the wagon through. Magnus Blackwood watched them pass, his face unreadable. But as Caleb rode by, Magnus leaned close and spoke so only Caleb could hear. This is not over, Stone. Not by half. I know. They locked Father Dominic and Marcus in separate cells. The jail was small, just 2 cells separated by iron bars, but it would hold them until the trial. Carter took Grace to her own home, where she could provide proper medical care. That night, Caleb sat on the porch of the town's only boarding house, too wired to sleep. Daniel found him there around midnight. Cannot rest either? No. Daniel pulled up a chair. For a while, they sat in silence, watching the empty street. Marcus's father came by the jail, Daniel said finally, demanding I release his son. Said this was all a misunderstanding. Said Marcus was just following orders. What did you tell him? That following illegal orders does not absolve you of responsibility. That if Marcus had a problem with what Father Dominic was doing, he should have come to me. Instead, he chose to cover it up. He chose to help kidnap Grace. Caleb nodded. How is she? Dr. Carter says she will recover physically, eventually, but the mental scars, Daniel trailed off. That kind of trauma does not heal quickly. No, it does not. Another silence. Then Daniel asked this question Caleb had been dreading. The children in Chicago. What really happened? Caleb closed his eyes. He had not talked about this in 7 years, had not let himself even think about it most of the time. But Daniel had been his partner. Daniel deserved to know. We found them in a warehouse, Caleb said quietly. 6 kids. The youngest was maybe 10. They had been taken by a trafficking ring that was connected to Senator William Bradford. Our supervisor, Marshal Hayes, told us to wait for federal authorization before we moved them. He said if we acted without proper clearance, the whole case would fall apart. Bradford would walk free. And you waited. I waited. I followed orders. I did everything by the book. Caleb's voice was rough. 4 days later, the warehouse burned. All 6 children died, including a girl named Lily Harper, 12 years old. I had promised her I would get her out. Daniel was quiet for a long time. Hayes gave you a direct order. You had no choice. I had a choice. I could have said to hell with the orders and gotten those kids out. But I was so concerned with doing things right, with following procedure, that I forgot the whole reason we became lawmen in the first place. We are supposed to protect people, not sacrifice them for the sake of a bigger case. Is that why you left? I left because I could not look at myself in the mirror anymore. Every time I put on that badge, all I could see was Lily's face, asking me why I left her there. Daniel leaned back in his chair. For what it is worth, I think you made the right choice this time. This time I did not wait for permission. I did not follow procedure. I just did what needed to be done. And you saved a life. Grace is alive because you did not make the same mistake twice. Caleb wanted to believe that, wanted to think that somehow saving Grace made up for failing Lily. But he knew it did not work that way. Lily was still dead. Those other 5 children were still dead. Nothing would ever change that. But Grace was alive. And maybe that was enough. Maybe that was all he could ask for. The next morning, word came from Judge Morgan. The trial would be held in 1 week, giving both sides time to prepare. In the meantime, Father Dominic and Marcus would remain in custody. Caleb spent the intervening days helping Daniel gather evidence and interview witnesses. It was delicate work. Many people in Covenant Ridge were loyal to the Catholic Church, and by extension, loyal to Father Dominic. They saw the arrest as an attack on their faith rather than the prosecution of a criminal. But others came forward, quietly, nervously, with stories they had been too afraid to tell before. Sarah Mitchell, the school teacher who had worked at the convent, provided a detailed account of the night she had witnessed Grace being beaten. She had kept silent out of fear, but now, with Grace safe and Father Dominic in custody, she found her courage. Mother Prioress Helen, after much hesitation and many tears, admitted that she had known about Father Dominic's methods for 8 years. She had witnessed him disciplining 3 different young nuns. She had told herself it was not her place to interfere, that Father Dominic was acting under the authority of the Church, that her duty was to protect the institution rather than the individuals within it. I am a coward, she said, weeping in Daniel's office. I stood outside that room and listened to Grace cry, and I did nothing. I let it happen because I was afraid of losing the convent, afraid of what the bishop would say, afraid of standing up to a man who claimed to speak for God. Daniel leaned forward. Mother Helen, was Sister Grace the only one? The old woman's shoulders shook. She shook her head slowly. No, there were others before her. 5 years ago, there was Sister Claire Donovan, just 19 years old when she came to us. Father Dominic began disciplining her within the first month. The same room, the same rope, the same whip. What happened to her? One morning she was simply gone. Father Dominic told us she had returned east to her family, that she had decided the religious life was not for her. But I saw her face the night before she left. She was not going home. She was running from him. Helen's voice dropped to barely a whisper. And before Claire, there was Sister Mary Therese. You know what they said about her death. An accident, a fall down the stairs. But I saw the bruises on her wrists before they dressed her body for burial. Rope burns, just like Grace's. She looked up at Daniel with red, swollen eyes. 3 young women, 3 lives destroyed. And I did nothing. God forgive me, I did nothing. Daniel documented everything carefully. Dates, times, specific incidents. By the end of the week, he had built a case that even Magnus Blackwood's expensive lawyers would have trouble defeating. But the most important testimony would come from Grace herself, and no one knew if she would be strong enough to testify. 6 days after the arrest, Caleb went to visit her at Dr. Carter's house. He found her sitting in the garden, wrapped in a shawl despite the warm afternoon. She looked better than she had. Some color had returned to her cheeks, and she had gained back a few pounds. But there was still a fragility to her, a brittleness that suggested she might shatter if handled too roughly. Mr. Stone, she smiled when she saw him. It was the first time Caleb had seen her smile. "I hoped you would come." He sat on the bench beside her, keeping a respectful distance. "How are you feeling?" Grace looked down at her hands, then back at him. "May I ask you something?" "Of course." "May I call you Caleb? After everything we have been through, Mr. Stone feels too formal, too distant." She hesitated. "Unless you prefer the formality." Caleb found himself surprised by how much he wanted to hear her say his name. "Caleb is fine, and I should call you Grace, not Miss Meredith." Grace, she tested the word, and something in her expression softened. "Yes, I would like that." For a moment, they simply sat there, and the shift between them was subtle but real. Not strangers anymore. Not rescuer and rescued. Just two people who had survived something terrible together. "How are you feeling, Grace?" "Stronger. Dr. Carter says my back is healing well. The ribs still hurt, but that will pass." She paused. "She also says I need to testify at the trial. That without my testimony, Father Dominic might go free." "You do not have to. We have other witnesses. Sarah Mitchell, Mother Helen. My own testimony about what I saw." "But it is not the same, is it? Everyone else is secondhand. They saw the aftermath or heard about it later. Only I know the full truth of what happened in that room." Caleb nodded slowly. "Testifying will be hard. His lawyers will try to discredit you. They will say you are lying, that you are mentally unstable, that you wanted this to happen." Grace's hands tightened on her shawl. "I know. Dr. Carter warned me." She looked at Caleb, and he saw the fear in her eyes. But he also saw determination. "But if I do not speak, then everything he did to me was for nothing. All that pain, all those years. If I stay silent now, then he wins." "You are very brave." "No," she shook her head. "I am terrified. But you taught me something, Mr. Stone. You taught me that sometimes doing the right thing means doing the thing that scares you most." Before Caleb could respond, Dr. Carter appeared at the garden door. "Grace, you have another visitor, Sister Ann Fletcher from the convent." A young nun, barely 20, stepped hesitantly into the garden. She was small and dark-haired, with the kind of face that looked like it had never quite lost its baby softness. When she saw Grace, she burst into tears. "I am so sorry." Anne fell to her knees beside the bench. "I knew what he was doing. I saw him hurt you so many times, and I never said anything. I never helped you. I just stood there like a coward." Grace reached out and took Anne's hand. "You were not a coward. You were scared. We all were. But you are speaking up now. You are testifying, and I want to do the same. I want to tell them what I saw. I want to make sure he never hurts anyone again." Caleb felt something shift in his chest. This young nun, frightened and guilty and brave despite her fear, reminded him of the person he used to be. For Chicago, before Lily, before he learned that sometimes following the rules meant people died. "Then you should testify," he said gently. "Both of you, together." Anne looked up at him, hope dawning in her eyes. "Will they listen? Will they believe two nuns against a priest?" "They will if I have anything to say about it." The day of the trial arrived with unseasonable heat. The town hall had been converted into a temporary courtroom. Every seat filled, people standing in the aisles and crowding the doorways. Judge Elizabeth Morgan presided from behind a heavy oak table, her face stern and impassive. Father Dominic sat at the defense table, flanked by two lawyers brought in from Denver. He was dressed in his clerical garb, and he had spent the morning before the trial hearing confessions and giving blessings to his supporters. It was a calculated move, designed to remind everyone that he was not just a man on trial, but a representative of the church itself. Marcus Reed sat at a separate table, also with a lawyer. His arm was still in a sling, and he looked pale and miserable. Daniel Crane served as the prosecutor, though he had little formal legal training. He had spent the past week reading law books and consulting with Judge Morgan by telegraph. Now he stood before the packed courtroom and began to lay out the case. He called Sarah Mitchell first. She testified about the night she witnessed Grace being beaten, her voice shaking but clear. Father Dominic's lawyer, a man named Victor Stratton, cross-examined her aggressively. "Miss Mitchell, how much had you had to drink that evening?" "I do not drink, sir." "But you had been working late. You were tired. Is it not possible you misinterpreted what you saw? I know what I saw. Sister Grace was tied to a table. Father Dominic was striking her with a whip. She was screaming. There was blood. I did not misinterpret anything. Stratton pressed harder, but Sarah held firm. When she finally stepped down, there were tears on her face, but her testimony stood. Next came Mother Helen. The old prioress looked like she had aged 10 years in the past week. Her voice was barely above a whisper as she described 8 years of willful blindness. I knew, she said. God help me, I knew. I heard the screams. I saw the marks. I knew what he was doing to those girls, and I did nothing. I told myself it was God's will, that Father Dominic knew better than I did, that it was not my place to question. But I was wrong. I was so terribly wrong. Stratton tried to discredit her, suggesting she was senile or confused, but the weight of her guilt was too evident to be dismissed. When she stepped down, she looked directly at Grace and mouthed 2 words. I am sorry. Dr. Carter testified next, presenting her medical findings with clinical precision. She had photographs, measurements, detailed notes. The evidence was overwhelming and impossible to explain away as accidents or self-inflicted injuries. Then came Reverend Josiah Blackwell, who testified about Sister Mary and the suspicious circumstances of her death. And finally, Caleb himself took the stand. He described what he had seen through the window of the Chapel of Penance. He spoke plainly, without embellishment, letting the facts speak for themselves. When he was done, Stratton stood for cross-examination. Mr. Stone, is it true that you were dismissed from the United States Marshal Service under questionable circumstances? I resigned. After children died while in your custody? Caleb felt every eye in the courtroom turn toward him. He forced himself to meet Stratton's gaze. 6 children died because I followed orders instead of doing what was right. That is true. And I have lived with that failure every day for 7 years, which is exactly why I am here now, because I will not make the same mistake twice. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Judge Morgan banged her gavel for order. Stratton smiled thinly. So you admit you have a history of poor judgment? No. I admit I have a history of letting protocol and authority override my conscience, and I am done with that. When the prosecution rested, it was the defense's turn. Stratton called character witnesses who testified to Father Dominic's piety and dedication. He called church officials who spoke about the long tradition of mortification of the flesh in Catholic practice. He tried to paint Father Dominic as a devout man following established religious principles rather than a criminal. But then Daniel called his final witness, Sister Grace Meredith. The courtroom fell absolutely silent as Grace walked to the witness stand. She was dressed simply, in a plain gray dress that Dr. Carter had given her. Her hair was pulled back, exposing her face. She looked young and vulnerable, and absolutely terrified. But she sat down, placed her hand on the Bible, and swore to tell the truth. Daniel began gently. Miss Meredith, please tell us when you entered Sacred Heart Convent. In 1879, I was 18 years old. And why did you enter? I had nowhere else to go. My parents were dead. I had no family. The convent offered me a place, a purpose. I thought I would find God there. And did you? Grace looked directly at Father Dominic. No, I found something else entirely. For the next hour, she described everything. The first time Father Dominic called her into the Chapel of Penance. The way he told her that doubt was sin, and sin must be purged through suffering. The beatings that came weekly, then twice weekly. The days spent locked in darkness without food or water. The constant message that she was worthless, sinful, deserving of punishment. Her voice never wavered. She did not cry. She simply told the truth, plainly and without theatrics. When she was done, Stratton rose for cross-examination. His voice was gentle, almost fatherly. Sister Grace, do you believe in God? I do. And do you believe that suffering can bring us closer to God? I believe that accepting the natural suffering of life can teach us compassion and strength. But I do not believe that God wants us to be tortured. But the saints suffered greatly. Saint Sebastian, Saint Lawrence, Saint Catherine herself, for whom your convent is named, they endured terrible torments. They were martyred by enemies of the faith, not by other Christians, not by priests who claimed to love them. Stratton's expression hardened. Is it not true that you repeatedly questioned your vocation? That you doubted your calling? Yes. So you were, in fact, a troubled young woman, uncertain, unstable. Grace's hands tightened in her lap, but her voice remained steady. I doubted because I was being hurt. I questioned whether I had a vocation because every day in that convent was torture. But Father Dominic told me the doubt itself was proof of my sinfulness. That if I truly loved God, I would accept the punishment without question. And did you ever try to leave? Where would I have gone? I had no money, no family, no skills beyond prayer and housework. Father Dominic made sure I knew that if I left, I would die on the streets, that the convent was my only hope of salvation. It was then that Father Dominic himself rose to his feet. His lawyer tried to pull him back down, but the priest shook him off. You were full of pride, Grace, Father Dominic said, his voice ringing through the courtroom. Full of doubt and rebellion. I was trying to save your immortal soul. Every blow was an act of love. Every punishment was meant to bring you closer to God. If you had only submitted, if you had accepted the discipline with a humble heart, you would have been purified. Grace stared at him, and then, for the first time since the trial began, she smiled. It was a sad smile, but it was genuine. I used to believe you, she said softly. I used to think that if I just tried harder, prayed more, accepted more pain, I would finally be good enough, finally be worthy. But then Mr. Stone looked through that window, and he did not see a sinner who deserved punishment. He saw a human being who needed help, and that was when I realized the truth. She stood facing Father Dominic fully. You were not trying to save my soul. You were trying to control me, to break me, to make me so afraid and so ashamed that I would never question you. And you almost succeeded, but you failed because someone stood up for me. Someone saw me as a person worth saving, and that taught me more about God than 8 years of your punishments ever did. The courtroom was absolutely silent. Even Stratton had no response. Judge Morgan leaned forward. Father Dominic, do you have anything else to say? The priest opened his mouth, then closed it. For the first time, he had no words. Then this court is adjourned until tomorrow, when I will render my verdict. That night, Caleb could not sleep. He walked through the empty streets of Covenant Ridge, his mind churning. Grace's testimony had been powerful, devastating. But would it be enough? Father Dominic still had powerful supporters, still had the weight of the church behind him. He found himself at the cemetery behind Reverend Josiah's church. The graves were dark shapes in the moonlight. He walked until he found the one he was looking for. Sister Mary Therese died at 20 years old. I am sorry I could not help you, he said quietly. But I helped Grace, that is something at least. Behind him a voice spoke. It is more than something. It is everything. He turned to find Grace standing at the cemetery gate. She was wrapped in a shawl, her face pale in the moonlight. You should not be out here alone. Neither should you. She walked toward him. I wanted to thank you for testifying, for everything. You do not need to thank me. Yes, I do, because you gave me something I thought I had lost forever. What is that? The belief that there are good people in the world, people who will stand up for others even when it costs them something. Caleb thought of Lily Harper, of the yellow ribbon he still carried, of 7 years spent trying to atone for a single failure. I am not a good person, Miss Meredith. I am just someone trying to do better than I did before. Grace reached out and took his hand. It was the first time she had voluntarily touched him. Then you are succeeding, she said softly. They stood together in the cemetery, two broken people who had somehow found a way to be strong for each other, and waited for the morning and the verdict that would change everything. The morning of the verdict broke clear and cold. Frost covered the ground, unusual for late July even at this elevation, and people took it as an omen. Of what, they could not say. But the entire town seemed to hold its breath as Judge Elizabeth Morgan took her seat behind the oak table that served as a bench. The courtroom was even more crowded than the day before. Every pew packed, people standing 3 deep along the walls. Outside, those who could not fit inside pressed against the windows, straining to hear. Father Dominic sat straight-backed at the defense table, his hands folded in prayer. Marcus Reed slumped beside his own lawyer, looking like he had not slept in days. On the other side of the room, Grace sat between Dr. Carter and Sister Ann, her face composed but her hands trembling slightly in her lap. Caleb stood at the back, one shoulder against the wall, Winchester held loosely in the crook of his arm. Daniel had deputized him for the day, giving him legal authority to maintain order. But really, Caleb knew, it was because Daniel wanted someone he trusted watching his back. Magnus Blackwood and his men filled the front rows, their faces hard and hostile. Judge Morgan shuffled her papers, then looked up. The room fell silent. This court has heard testimony over 2 days. We have examined evidence. We have listened to witnesses for both the prosecution and the defense. Now it falls to me to render judgment. She paused, and Caleb saw her eyes move across the courtroom, taking in every face. The defense argues that Father Dominic Reeves was acting within his religious authority, that the discipline he administered was in keeping with centuries of Catholic tradition regarding mortification of the flesh, that Sister Grace Meredith was a willing participant in her own spiritual development. Magnus Blackwood nodded, a small smile touching his lips. However, Judge Morgan continued, the evidence tells a different story. Dr. Carter's medical examination documented 23 separate scars on Miss Meredith's back, ranging in age from several weeks to several years. 2 improperly healed rib fractures, severe malnutrition, chronic trauma to the wrists and shoulders consistent with repeated binding. The smile vanished from Magnus's face. This was not spiritual discipline. This was torture, systematic, prolonged, inflicted on a vulnerable young woman who had no family, no resources, and no way to escape. And it was done not once, but repeatedly, over a period of 8 years. Judge Morgan's voice grew harder. The testimony of Mother Prioress Helen confirms that Father Dominic engaged in this behavior with at least 3 different young women. Sister Mary Therese, who died under mysterious circumstances. Sister Claire, who disappeared and has not been heard from in 2 years. And Sister Grace Meredith, who survived only because Mr. Stone happened to look through a window at the right moment. Grace's hand found Sister Ann's and gripped it tightly. Furthermore, the evidence shows that Deputy Marcus Reed knowingly participated in an attempt to remove Miss Meredith from the jurisdiction of this court. He helped Father Dominic kidnap her from the convent and transport her toward Denver, presumably to hide her in an institution where she could not testify. Judge Morgan looked directly at Father Dominic. You are a man of God, Father Reeves, or so you claim. But the God I read about in Scripture does not command us to break the innocent. He does not demand that we torture those who doubt. He does not require suffering as proof of faith. What you did to these women was not religion. It was abuse. And you hid behind your collar and your position to escape accountability. She picked up her gavel. I find Father Dominic Reeves guilty of assault and battery, false imprisonment, and abuse of authority. I sentence him to 25 years in the Colorado State Penitentiary. The gavel came down with a crack like a gunshot. The courtroom erupted. Shouts of outrage from Father Dominic's supporters. Cries of relief from others. Magnus Blackwood surged to his feet, his face purple with rage. This is persecution, an attack on the church itself. I will appeal to the governor, to the president if necessary. Judge Morgan's gavel came down again, harder this time. Mr. Blackwood, if you do not sit down and be silent, I will hold you in contempt. Your brother has been found guilty in a court of law. He will serve his sentence. As for you, Deputy Reed, she turned her attention to Marcus, who had gone white as paper. You are guilty of conspiracy and obstruction of justice. I sentence you to 10 years imprisonment. Marcus made a choking sound but did not speak. And Mother Prioress Helen, the old nun sitting in the front row, looked up with red-rimmed eyes. You are guilty of no crime under the law, but you are guilty of moral cowardice. You stood by and allowed these atrocities to happen. You chose institutional loyalty over human decency. I cannot send you to prison, but I can ensure you never again hold a position of authority. You are hereby removed from your post as Mother Prioress and banned from serving in any supervisory role within any religious institution in the Colorado Territory. Helen bowed her head, tears streaming down her face. Judge Morgan stood. This court is adjourned. Bailiff, remove the prisoners. Daniel and two other deputies moved forward to take Father Dominic into custody. The priest did not resist, but as he was led past Grace, he stopped. "You will burn in hell for this," he said quietly. "You have destroyed a servant of God. You have attacked the church itself. And for what? Your own pride? Your inability to accept discipline?" Grace stood. She was shaking, but her voice was clear. "No, Weston, you will answer to Myriad for what you did. And when you stand before him, you will not be able to hide behind your collar or your position. He will see the truth. And the truth is that you used his name to justify cruelty. You perverted his teachings to satisfy your need for control. And you broke 3 women who trusted you." Father Dominic's face twisted with fury, but before he could respond, Daniel pulled him away. Marcus was led out next. Then the courtroom began to empty. People filed out in small groups, some angry, some satisfied, all shaken by what they had witnessed. Caleb remained where he was, watching Grace. She stood surrounded by well-wishers, people offering congratulations and support, but he could see the exhaustion in her face, the way she swayed slightly on her feet. He caught Dr. Carter's eye and nodded toward the door. The doctor understood immediately. "All right, everyone. That is enough for now. Grace needs rest. You can speak with her another time." She shepherded Grace toward the side door, and Caleb fell in behind them, providing a barrier against the crowd. Outside, the autumn sun was warm despite the morning frost. Grace leaned against the courthouse wall and closed her eyes. "Is it really over?" she whispered. "The trial is over," Caleb said, "but the healing, that will take longer." Grace opened her eyes and looked at him. "How long did it take you to heal from what happened in Chicago?" Caleb thought about that. About 7 years on the mountain. 7 years of solitude and silence. 7 years of carrying Lily's ribbon like a talisman of guilt. "I am not sure I have healed," he said honestly, "but I have learned to live with it, and maybe that is enough." 3 months passed. Autumn deepened into winter. The aspen turned gold, then lost their leaves entirely. Snow came to the high country, heavy and early, sealing Caleb's cabin in a world of white. But he did not return to his mountain refuge. Not yet. Grace had moved into a small cottage behind Dr. Carter's house. She spent her days helping in the medical practice, learning to treat wounds and mix medicines. She had a talent for it, Dr. Carter said. Gentle hands and a calm presence that put frightened patients at ease. She also began teaching. 3 afternoons a week, children from the poorer families in town would gather in Reverend Josiah's church, and Grace would teach them to read and write. She used no religious texts. Instead, she taught from books of poetry and history, opening worlds these children had never imagined. Caleb helped when he could. He was not much for teaching, but he could chop wood for the church stove and make sure the building stayed warm. He could walk Grace home on the nights when her lessons ran late and the streets were dark. They talked during these walks about everything and nothing, about the future and the past, about faith and doubt, and the strange paths that had brought them to this moment. One evening in late October, as they walked beneath a sky full of stars, Grace asked him a question he had been dreading. "Will you go back to your mountain when winter truly sets in?" Caleb did not answer immediately. He had been asking himself the same question for weeks. The cabin was waiting. Storm was growing restless in the town stable, unused to confinement. The solitude that had sustained him for 7 years called to him like a distant song. But something else held him here, something he was not quite ready to name. "I do not know," he said finally. "Do you want me to?" Grace stopped walking. They were standing in front of her cottage, lamplight spilling from the windows. "I want you to do what makes you happy," she said. "But I would miss you if you left." The words hung between them, simple and profound. "I would miss you too." Grace smiled, and Caleb realized it was the first time he had seen her smile without sadness behind it. "Then perhaps you should stay. At least for the winter. Dr. Carter says she could use help with the heavy work, wood chopping, snow clearing, and Reverend Josiah wants to expand the school. He asked if you might help him build additional rooms. You have been planning this. Is that wrong?" Caleb found himself smiling too, which was something he had not done much of in 7 years. "No, it is not wrong." That winter, Caleb became a fixture in Covenant Ridge. He built the addition to the church, working alongside Josiah and a crew of volunteers. He helped Dr. Carter tend to patients during a brutal outbreak of influenza. He taught a 16-year-old boy named Tommy Brennan how to track and hunt, passing on skills that might otherwise be lost. Tommy was an orphan living with his uncle on a small farm outside town. He reminded Caleb of himself at that age, hungry to learn, hungry to prove himself. And every Sunday he walked with Grace to the edge of town, and they would sit on a fallen log and talk about the week that had passed and the week to come. Spring arrived, then summer, and Caleb found he had no desire to return to his mountain. One evening in early June, a year after the trial, Daniel came to find him at the church where he was helping repair the roof. "Caleb, I need to talk to you." The sheriff's face was grave, and Caleb felt a familiar tension settle between his shoulder blades, the tension that had always preceded trouble. "What is wrong?" "Magnus Blackwood is dead. Heart attack. Died in his sleep 3 nights ago." Caleb set down his hammer. And? And in his will, he left a substantial sum of money to the church, specifically to rebuild Sacred Heart Convent. But there is a condition. The money can only be used if Father Dominic is released from prison and reinstated as the head priest. Caleb felt something cold settle in his stomach. He is trying to buy his brother's freedom. The church is already lobbying the governor. They are saying Father Dominic has been rehabilitated, that he has found a new understanding of his ministry. They want him pardoned. Will the governor do it? Daniel's silence was answer enough. Grace took the news calmly when Caleb told her that evening. Too calmly. "I knew this would happen eventually," she said. "Men like Magnus Blackwood do not simply accept defeat. Even in death, he is still trying to win. The governor has not made a decision yet. There is still time to fight this." "And if we fight and lose, what then?" Grace looked at him, and he saw not fear in her eyes, but a kind of weary acceptance. "Father Dominic will come back. He will rebuild his power. And eventually he will find a way to punish everyone who stood against him. Then we leave. You, me, Dr. Carter, Josiah. We go somewhere he cannot reach us." Grace shook her head. "I am tired of running, Caleb. I ran from my parents' death into the convent. I ran from myself for 8 years, believing I deserved punishment. I am done running." "Then what do? We keep living. We keep teaching those children. We keep helping the sick. We keep building something good. And if Father Dominic comes back?" Grace's voice hardened. "Then we face him. Together." But they did not have to face him. 2 weeks later, news arrived that sent shock waves through Covenant Ridge. Father Dominic Reeves was dead. He had been killed in a prison riot, caught in the wrong place when violence erupted between rival factions. The prison warden assured everyone it was a tragic accident. Just one of those things that happened in such places. Caleb suspected otherwise. Prison riots did not just happen. Someone had arranged it. Someone with money and influence. Someone who had decided that a dead priest was better than a freed one, who might talk about the powerful men who had protected him. But there was no way to prove it, and frankly, Caleb was not sure he wanted to. Justice took many forms. Sometimes it came from a courtroom. Sometimes it came from darker places. Grace wept when she heard the news. Not from sadness, but from relief. The weight she had been carrying for so long finally lifted, and the tears came in great, shuddering sobs that left her exhausted and empty. Caleb held her while she cried, and when she was done, she looked up at him with red eyes and said something he would remember for the rest of his life. "I forgive him, not because he deserves it, but because I need to be free of him. Completely free." Summer faded into autumn again. The cycle of seasons continued, indifferent to human drama. Grace's school grew. She now taught every afternoon, and Sister Anne had joined her, having left the convent permanently. Together, they had enrolled 32 children, some as young as 6, others as old as 15. Dr. Carter took on Grace as an official apprentice. In a few more years, with proper study and examination, Grace might become a licensed physician herself. Caleb continued his work around town, building, repairing, helping where he was needed. He no longer thought of himself as a hermit or a mountain man. He was just Caleb, a member of a community, someone who belonged. One evening in late September, as he and Grace sat on their usual log at the edge of town, she asked him about the future. "Where do you see yourself in 10 years? Caleb thought about that. 10 years ago, he had been running from Chicago, running from failure and guilt. He could never have imagined himself here, in this place with this woman beside him. I do not know, he said honestly. I never thought I would live this long. Never thought I would find a reason to. And now I think I would like to see those children we are teaching grow up. I think I would like to help Jazaga build that new wing he keeps talking about. I think, he paused, choosing his words carefully. I think I would like to keep walking with you, if you will have me. Grace was quiet for a long moment. Then she leaned her head against his shoulder, and Caleb felt something in his chest that he had not felt in a very long time. Peace. The years passed. Grace did become a doctor, one of the first female physicians in Colorado. She opened her own practice, taking over when Dr. Carter retired. She specialized in treating women and children, particularly those who had been abused or traumatized. She never married. Neither did Caleb. But they remained together in a relationship that defied easy definition. More than friends, less than lovers. Something uniquely their own. Tommy Brennan, the 16-year-old boy Caleb had taught to hunt and track in the winter of 1887, grew into a fine man. He married at 23, had his first child at 25. And when his son Samuel turned 12 in 1915, Tommy was 45 years old. He brought the boy up the mountain to meet the old man who had changed his father's life 29 years before, which brought the story full circle, back to that porch on that autumn afternoon in 1915. Caleb finished speaking. The sun had moved considerably across the sky during his telling. Tommy and Samuel sat in silence, absorbing everything they had heard. So that is the truth, Tommy said finally. That is who you are. That is who I was, Caleb corrected. I am different now. Grace changed me. This town changed me. You changed me, Tommy, when I taught you to set snares and read tracks. All of you reminded me that isolation is not strength, that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is let people in. Samuel, who had been quiet throughout the story, finally spoke. Did you love her, Miss Grace? Caleb considered the question. It was one he had asked himself many times over the years. I do, but not in the way you might think. I loved her the way you love someone who saves your life, because that is what she did. She saved me from myself. By letting you save her? Yes, exactly that. They heard a wagon approaching up the mountain trail. Caleb stood, knowing without looking who it would be. Grace appeared around the bend, driving a small cart pulled by an aging mare. She was 74 now, her dark hair turned silver, her face lined with wrinkles. But her eyes were still gray and clear, and when she saw Caleb, she smiled. I thought I might find you up here, telling stories. She climbed down from the cart with Tommy's help, moving stiffly but steadily. Samuel jumped up to offer her his seat, and she ruffled his hair affectionately. Thank you, young man. Your father has told me much about you. She settled into the chair and looked at Caleb. So, you told him everything? Everything, including the part about Lily Harper? Especially that part. Grace nodded approvingly. Good, that is an important part of the story. The part about failure and redemption. Samuel looked between them, confused. But Mr. Stone said you saved him. How did you save him? Grace smiled. By letting him be a hero when he needed it most. By giving him a second chance to do what he could not do before. Sometimes, Samuel, the greatest gift you can give someone is the opportunity to be better than they were. She reached out and took Caleb's weathered hand in her own. We saved each other, she said simply. That is the real truth of this story. The four of them sat together as the afternoon light turned golden. Tommy asked questions about the trial, about what happened to Sacred Heart Convent, about the other people involved in the story. The convent had been reorganized under new leadership, Grace told him. Mother Helen had lived another 10 years, spending her final days in quiet penitence. Sister Anne had eventually married and had children of her own. Marcus Reed had served his full sentence and died shortly after his release, a broken man. And Sacred Heart itself had been transformed. No more chapel of penance. No more instruments of torture disguised as spiritual discipline. It was now a place of genuine sanctuary where women could come for help without fear. As the sun began to set, Tommy stood. We should go. We have a long ride back to town. Samuel hesitated. Mr. Stone, can I ask you one more thing? Of course. Do you still think about her? Lily Harper? Caleb felt Grace's hand tighten around his. Every day, he said quietly, but it does not hurt the way it used to. Now when I think of her, I also think of Grace and all the other people I have helped over the years. One failure does not define you. What defines you is what you do after. Samuel nodded, processing this. As Tommy and his son mounted their horses and prepared to leave, Samuel called back one more question. What would you want us to remember? If you could leave us with one thing? Caleb thought for a long moment. I would want you to remember that doing the right thing is not always easy. Sometimes it means going against authority. Sometimes it means standing alone. Sometimes it means risking everything. But if you see someone suffering and you have the power to help, you have an obligation to act. Do not wait for permission. Do not wait for the perfect moment. Just act. Even if we fail, even if you fail, because trying and failing is better than not trying at all. Tommy and Samuel rode down the mountain as twilight gathered. Caleb and Grace sat together on the porch watching them go. Do you think he understood? Grace asked. The boy? Maybe, or maybe he will understand later when he faces his own choice between doing what is easy and doing what is right. Grace leaned against him, and they sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to appear overhead. Do you ever regret it? Caleb asked suddenly, leaving the convent, speaking out against Father Dominic, everything that came after. Not for a moment. That life was not really living. It was just existing, surviving. What I have now. She gestured at the valley below, at the lights beginning to glow in the windows of Covenant Ridge. This is living. I am glad. They sat until the stars filled the sky, two old souls who had found each other in the darkest of circumstances and had somehow built a life worth living. Finally, as the night grew cold, they went inside. Grace would stay the night, as she often did now. Tomorrow they would ride back to town together, and the cycle would begin again. Patients to see, children to teach, a community that needed them. But for now, in the warmth of the cabin, they simply existed together. Two people who had been broken and had healed. Not completely, perhaps never completely, but enough. Enough to live, enough to help others, enough to look at themselves in the mirror without flinching. And that, Caleb thought, as he stoked the fire and Grace settled into her chair with a book, was more than he had ever hoped for when he first climbed this mountain 29 years ago. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of pine and snow. Winter was coming again. But inside the cabin, all was warm and light. And in the valley below, in a small schoolhouse beside a church, 32 children slept soundly, never knowing that their teacher had once been a prisoner and their carpenter had once been a man who ran from his own conscience. Never knowing, but benefiting nonetheless from the choices those two people had made, from their courage, from their decision to stand up when it would have been easier to walk away. That was the legacy, not glory or fame or recognition, just the quiet knowledge that they had made the world a little bit better. One child taught, one wound healed, one person saved, one day at a time. And in the end, Caleb thought, that was all any of us could hope for. To do a little good, to ease a little suffering, to stand up when standing up mattered. The rest was just details. Caleb lay in his bed that night, listening to Grace's steady breathing from the next room. Through the window, he could see stars scattered across the black sky like seeds thrown by an unseen hand. He thought of Lily Harper one last time, of the yellow ribbon he had finally buried beneath a pine tree on the mountain 3 years ago, letting it go at last. He had kept his promise, not to her. She was beyond promises now, but to himself, and to Grace, and to every person he had helped in the years between. I did not save you, Lily, he whispered into the darkness, but I saved the next one, and maybe that is enough. Outside, an owl called. The wind moved through the pines with a sound like breathing. And inside the cabin, two old souls who had found each other in the darkest of places slept peacefully, knowing they had done what few people manage in a lifetime. They had taken their greatest failure and turned it into their greatest strength. They had learned that redemption is not about erasing the past. It is about choosing differently when the past repeats itself. They had stood up when it mattered most. And in doing so, they had saved not just each other but themselves.